The GeForce RTX 5060 is perhaps the best GPU at its price point right now. That's not to say it's good enough, it's still a downgrade from the 3060 in terms of VRAM, and in better times a card featuring this GB206 GPU would have been called a 5050, but it's still faster than anything else priced under £300. Raw performance, however, isn't the only metric, so I wanted to see how it compares to some older and weaker cards in terms of value, just in case for some reason you don't feel like giving Nvidia your money. The cards in this test are the RTX 5060 as provided by Asus, as well as the RTX 4060 that preceded it and the Arc B580, both of which I bought for myself. The 4060 is a pretty straightforward one. It's got most of the same limitations, like the 8GB of VRAM and x8 PCI interface as its younger brother. The B580 is in the same weight class as the other cards, but boasts 12GB of GDDR6, slower than the 5060s, but more of it. I'd like to have tested more, but the only comparable Radeon I have right now is the RX 6750 GRE. Supplies of that card were never that great to begin with, originally being a China exclusive and mostly finding its way to the West via dropshippers and AliExpress, and the few left on the market are horribly overpriced. The upcoming 9060 XT is positioned as a 5060 Ti competitor, and I haven't received my copy at the time of writing, so that video will have to wait. It's probably going to make the old 7600 XT and 7700 XT obsolete, and if that means they get a massive price drop, then perhaps I'll have to buy them to compare. But for now, this group test is short one Radeon. The test rig is my moderately priced gaming PC featuring a Ryzen 5 7500F and 32GB of DDR5 on a B650 motherboard. The 7500F gets a bit of a bad rap from some commenters who I presume are mistaking it for the 8400F. It is just a 7600X without the integrated graphics, and therefore shouldn't be a bottleneck to these GPUs at the quality settings I'm testing, but I have to admit I made a bit of an error with the motherboard. The B650 doesn't support PCIe Gen 5, a fact I'd forgotten until after I'd grabbed this data. I know Digital Foundry talked about possibly doing a PCIe scaling video in their 5060 review, and it's possible someone's already made one, but it might be something I look at in the future. As it stands though, there's an outside possibility that the 5060 will do slightly better in some games when paired with a Gen 5 motherboard, but if you're in possession of a Gen 4 platform, or one which only uses Gen 5 for storage, then these numbers should be pretty accurate for you. To ascertain the value of these GPUs, first we need to see how they perform. The latest entry in the Doom series is a pretty solid experience at 1080 medium on the 5060, averaging 75 FPS. This is a very healthy improvement over the 4060, which at 61 FPS is almost 20% slower than the new model. The Intel meanwhile has the VRAM to run at above the medium preset, which neither of the GeForces can say, but it lacks the necessary performance. At least at native resolution, the B580 is within margin of error of the 4060 at medium, and raising the settings is only going to send it below the 60 mark. The 5060 enjoys a smaller lead in Expedition 33. It's still averaging well over 70 FPS at the high quality preset, but this time the 4060 is a bit more viable. It averages 64 FPS at the same settings, about 12% below the 5060, and lows are above 50. The B580 meanwhile only averages 52 FPS, over 25% lower than the 5060, and so ironically would need dropping to low or medium, or adding some XeSS to hit the 60 mark. As I said in the last video, the 5060 is only borderline at 1080p high in Assassin's Creed Shadows. The built-in benchmark completes with a 60 FPS average and spends a fair amount of time below that. The 4060 meanwhile is 13% slower at 52 FPS, and the B580 is almost 25% slower at 46 FPS. both the 4060 and B580 are around 20% behind the leader in Alan Wake 2. Actually, for once, the Intel beats the older GeForce, if only by a couple of frames. However, this game doesn't have XeSS support, so if you want to try and get a 60 plus experience or play on a 1440p display, you're stuck with FSR. We have virtually a three-way tie in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, a game whose performance is perhaps the most VRAM constrained of any I've ever tested. Both 8GB cards will give a memory warning in the settings menu at low or medium, and at high or above they're likely to crash or give graphical errors. I benchmarked everything at medium, at which point only the B580 is not being held back by a lack of memory. The 11GB RTX 2080 Ti scored 88 FPS in this test, despite being largely equivalent or lower than the 5060 otherwise, and the 16GB 5060 Ti hits 87 FPS at very ultra, so this is a pretty clear case for why the 5060 and 4060 needed more VRAM. Oh, and one more thing to note, the last time I tried out the B580 in this game, it had a major problem with CPU utilization, and I can report that is now fixed. The Last of Us Part 2 does not seem to be VRAM limited on any of these cards at 1080p high. Very high is a different matter, but in the context of the new market, these are technically budget GPUs, so I don't think it's unreasonable to expect to have to drop settings a bit. The 5060 hits a frankly excessive 100 FPS, while the 4060 is about 25% lower at 75.5 FPS, and the B580 just beats the 4060 by a few frames. The 5060 beats the 4060 by about 20% in Veilguard. Running at the Ultra preset, it achieves 84 FPS, where its predecessor only manages 67. The B580 still manages to pass 60 FPS, but is more than 25% behind the 5060 and a few frames behind the 4060. The 5060 is the only one of the three that can deliver a 60 plus experience at 1080 Ultra in God of War Ragnarok. The 4060 only just misses the mark, being 20% lower than the 5060's 74 FPS average, while the B580 is about 25% lower at just 56 FPS. I'd normally expect similar results in Horizon Forbidden West, but while the 5060 is very close to the numbers in Ragnarok, the 4060 and B580 hold up a little better. At least in the area outside Chain Scrape, those two can still manage a 60 plus average and are only 8 to 10% behind the 5060. The 4060 is about 23% behind the 5060 in Kingdom Come 2, while the B580 is only about 20% behind. All three are well over 60 FPS at ultra quality, so unless you want to step up to 1440p, there's not much practical benefit to the 5060 here. Black Myth Wukong, meanwhile, needs all the performance it can get, and the B580 is clearly not the right choice for this game. The 4060 holds up very well, only about 10% behind the 5060 at 1080 high, but the B580 fell well behind. Using the standard AA solution, it only managed about 45 FPS, but I found switching to XeSS anti-aliasing bumped that up to 50. I don't know whether this is a weird bug in the driver, or the BMW team secretly applying upscaling to the XeSS AA setting. Given their attitude to stuff like frame generation, I really wouldn't put it past them. I'm informed that Monster Hunter Wilds benchmark utility is useless now, as it doesn't represent current game performance. Still, I've got the numbers, and it at least shows how the cards compare to each other. Again, the 5060 is the only one to post over 60 FPS at 1080 high, the 4060 is about 17% slower at 56 FPS, and the B580 is almost 30% slower at 48 FPS. I may have been a bit optimistic choosing the high preset for Stalker 2. Not for VRAM reasons, just for a general lack of performance. All three failed to hit 60, but the 4060 is only 7% behind the 5060 this time around, and the B580 is about 20% behind at 45 FPS. It's pretty clear that the Intel folks put a lot of development work into making sure Arc performs well in Cyberpunk 2077, and it shows. The 5060 passes 108 FPS at 1080 Ultra, while the B580 is only 12% behind at nearly 96 FPS. The 4060 meanwhile is languishing in the high 70s, more than 25% slower than the new card. Being an RT fan on a budget is like being a sports car enthusiast in a country without paved roads, and many of the tested games have some degree of software ray tracing enabled by default anyway. But I tested a few games with some higher RT settings enabled too. AC Shadows offers full hardware global illumination and reflections, and that can take a toll even on the 5060, so I used quality DLSS on the GeForces, which saw the 5060 almost hit 60 FPS, and the 4060 reached 53, about 10% below the newer model. The Arc card, meanwhile, uses XeSS, which has an equivalent to quality DLSS called Ultra Quality, but Ubisoft didn't include it as a preset. It does, however, allow manual scaling, and as quality DLSS is 44% of full resolution in this case, I dialed in that same amount into the XeSS upscaling for the B580. The result was not great. At just short of 45 FPS, it's 25% behind the 5060. Things don't go well for the Intel in Alan Wake 2 either. The high preset uses path tracing, which the B580 can at least handle better than the first generation RTX cards like the 2080 Ti, but the game lacks XeSS or even a good version of FSR, so at 1080p with quality FSR it averages 27 FPS and looks like crap. Maybe there's a mod? BMW continues to have no time for the Intel, with the 5060 able to put in almost 50 FPS, the 4060 about 10 frames and 20% lower, and the B580 only managing a cinematic 24 FPS, half of the new GeForce. Alas, a lot of the momentum the B580 had in Cyberpunk is gone once ray tracing's enabled. The 5060 maintains a solid lead with 74 FPS, while the other cards are only just over 60, about 16 to 17% below the new GPU. All three cards were benchmarked with the legacy CNN model, as that isn't available on Arc series cards. From my testing, the 5060 loses about 5%, and the 4060 loses about 10% with the Transformer model. Still, that, plus ray reconstruction, means that Cyberpunk's RT simply looks better on an Nvidia card. Okay, so nobody should be surprised by these results. Of course the 5060 beats the others, that's the point of it. In rasterized rendering, it holds about a 17% lead over its immediate predecessor, and 19% over the Battle Mage. In ray tracing, that opens up to 19% versus the 4060, and 28% versus the B580. Those differences might be meaningful if performance is your only metric, but these cards are aimed at budget gamers, so what's more important for many of us is value. The 5060 is, at the time of writing, available in stock for as low as £269 or $299, though of course that US price is before tariffs or whatever. At that price, an RTX 4060 would have to cost about £224 or $249 to be the same value as the cheapest 5060. Right now, that doesn't seem to be feasible on the new market, but as retailers start to clear inventory, it may be the case you start to see some bargains pop up. Most interesting will be the used market. A 4060 for less than £200 or $230 could be a very appealing prospect, particularly if you're not into the latest games. Plus, if you like Nvidia's products but don't like the company, Buying used ensures your money is going to the previous owner's pockets rather than Team Green's. Not forgetting, of course, that the RTX 50 series has lost 32-bit PhysX support, so if you're into much older games like the Rocksteady Batman series or Mirror's Edge, that alone could be a good enough reason to own a 4060 over a 5060. The Arc B580, meanwhile, is in a bit of trouble. It needs to cost £218 or $242 to match the 5060 for value, and that seems unlikely. There was already speculation that Intel might have been selling these cards at a loss, and knocking another 15 to 20% off the retail price doesn't seem like a business plan that leads to us getting a C580 next year. Meanwhile, in the US, the Arc cards seem quite absent from shelves, and the few models that are there are somewhat overpriced. Whether this is related to the tariff panic or a sign of something else, I don't know. Perhaps stock will return soon, and then again, perhaps the cheapest 5060s will suddenly dry up, and we'll need to decide whether a $400 5060 is worth buying against its cheaper opposition. Hopefully this information will help you out either way. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.